What's up guys, my name is Ace, and is the ITRA Burst overpowered in CoD World War II? Today we're going to be taking a look at this question. I'm going to be looking at the stats of it a little bit. I'm not going to go into great detail like I do with my gun guides, which by the way, if you guys want to check out all the detailed stats for this, I will leave a link to that gun guide in the description below. But we're going to be taking a look at the stats. I'm going to compare it a little bit to the previous 4-round burst rifles we've seen in Call of Duty before, like in Black Ops 2 and Black Ops 3. And I'm going to be taking a look at it from the perspective of the competitive scene, as well as the perspective of public matches. First up, let's compare the ITRA Burst with the Black Ops 2 M8, as well as the Black Ops 3 M8. A little disclaimer here, it isn't necessarily fair to compare weapons across different Call of Duty titles, because they're competing in different metas. They have different guns that they're going up against, there's different map styles, there's different movement styles, especially when we look at Black Ops 3, so it's not a 100% fair comparison. This is more so just to clear up some misconceptions that I've been seeing in the community, some people stating some incorrect stats with them. And also, it is great just for comparison's sake for how something feels, so maybe you guys don't have the ITRA Burst, so you haven't really used it a whole lot, but you've used the M8s in the past, so you want to be able to have an indication of what it's going to feel like in comparison to the M8s from the past. So for all three of these guns we're going to be looking at across these three titles, they're all 4-round burst rifles, and they all will generally take 4 shots to kill within about 30 to 40 meters. There's a slight variance in range. The Black Ops 2 M8 has a very slightly shorter 4-shot kill range than the ITRA Burst, as well as the Black Ops 3 M8, but it also does have a very short 3-shot kill range that the Black Ops 3 M8 and the ITRA Burst don't have. The most important stats to compare, though, are going to be the rate of fire and the burst delay. So in Black Ops 2, the rate of fire within the burst, so just the rate of fire of the 4 shots within the burst, is 1,250 rounds per minute, which is insanely fast. Then between each burst, we have a delay of 112 milliseconds. As for Black Ops 3, the M8 has a rate of fire of 1,000 rounds per minute within the burst, and its delay is noticeably longer at 166 milliseconds. Finally, we have the ITRA Burst in World War II. With this one, we have a rate of fire of 968 rounds per minute within the burst, and its burst delay is exactly the same as the Black Ops 2 M8 at 112 milliseconds. So I've seen some people incorrectly state that the ITRA Burst is actually a better version of the Black Ops 2 M8. This is simply not true. The Black Ops 2 M8 is better in pretty much every single category you can think of. As for the comparison between the Black Ops 3 M8 and the ITRA Burst, it's kind of debatable. You do get a faster fire rate within the burst with the M8 in Black Ops 3, but you also have a noticeably longer burst delay, and therefore I personally would say the ITRA Burst is just a little bit better than the M8 from Black Ops 3. Like I said though, they're all competing against different guns, so this isn't necessarily like the final word on whether the ITRA is overpowered, because the ITRA isn't going against an AN-94 from Black Ops 2, or the Scorpion, or the MSMC, or the FAL, which is significantly better than any of the semi-autos you see in World War II. It's a completely different meta, and therefore it can't really be compared fairly across different titles. In my opinion though, the ITRA Burst in CoD World War II is not overpowered, at least not to any extreme extent where it needs immediate action taken against it. It's one of those high-risk, high-reward rifles that requires a lot of skill and consistency with your aim in order to excel with. If you have bad aim, you're going to do terrible with the ITRA Burst. But if you have godlike aim or really good aim, you have the potential to absolutely dominate with this gun because its time to kill, assuming you're one-bursting your enemy, is better than pretty much everything in the game aside from one-shot kill weapons. So in public matches at least, I think the ITRA Burst is in a perfectly fine place. For most public match Call of Duty players out there, they're not going to have the consistency with their aim to be one-bursting people all over the place all the time. Yes, there are some really good players out there that will be doing this, and they'll be taking advantage of that because they've developed the skills to be able to have that consistent aim, but put this in the hand of an average to slightly below average player, and they're likely going to struggle to find any sort of consistency with this weapon. The problem starts to arise when you look at it in the competitive scene, when you're looking at players that do have that godlike accuracy and very rarely miss any shots. At that point, it becomes a lot more arguable that this gun is overpowered within that particular meta, within that particular scene. Why would any of the pros choose to use any of the other rifles in the game when the ITRA Burst has a faster time to kill as well as pinpoint accuracy even across the map? There's really no reason, especially after they have nerfed the FG42 pretty much into oblivion, so its time to kill just doesn't keep up and it's not really viable for the competitive scene anymore. But even like the BAR and the STG44, why would they use those when they can use the ITRA Burst, and as long as they maintain that perfect accuracy that they tend to have, they're going to absolutely dominate anything aside from SMGs at really close ranges. So I can definitely see how the ITRA has thrown a wrench in the balance of things when it comes to the competitive scene, but I don't think this is a good enough reason to nerf it for public match players. It's a completely different game that they're playing, and they're also playing it at a completely different level. I see this as being exactly the same as the M1 Garand. A few months back, we saw this big controversy in the competitive scene where there was a big talk about the M1 Garand being overpowered in competitive. If you have pinpoint accuracy and a decent trigger finger, nothing really competes with the time to kill of the M1 Garand, except now the ITRA Burst. As a result, in the hands of a pro player that doesn't miss shots often, the M1 Garand had such a fast time to kill that there was not much reason to use anything else in competitive. When we look at public matches though, hardly anybody was using the M1 Garand because it's not a very versatile gun. It doesn't work well for 6v6 because if you start dealing with multiple enemies, you only have an 8-round clip, and therefore you're often going to be screwed. Also, you put it in the hands of an average player, they're going to be missing shots like crazy, especially with that pretty high vertical recoil that it has. And the M1 Garand is a very unforgiving gun as well. As soon as you miss even just one shot, your time to kill shoots through the roof, and you're no longer being competitive with the other weapons in the game. This is why there's currently a gentleman's agreement to not use the M1 Garand, or perhaps they eventually banned it. I'm not 100% sure on that. In either case, you don't see pros using the M1 Garand in competitive play because it doesn't meet their time to kill goals, and it throws a wrench in the meta. It basically eliminates variety, and everybody would be using it, and I don't think it would be that exciting to watch all the pros just using M1 Garands. I think the ITRA Burst is exactly the same story as the M1 Garand. In the hands of a pro player in a competitive environment, I can definitely see the argument for this gun being overpowered. However, throw it in the hands of an average player in public matches, we're talking like 95+% of the entire player base in Call of Duty, and it's just fine the way it is. If they were to nerf it for everybody, I don't think this gun would be touched by any of the average to slightly below average players, because they wouldn't be able to find any consistency with it whatsoever. And even some of the better players, I think they would start dropping it and just sticking with the old guns that we had access to before. So I really don't feel the ITRA Burst needs any adjustment whatsoever. If the pros don't like it for their scene, they should either have a gentleman's agreement not to use it, or just ban it in general. Or another solution is start giving little buffs to other rifles in the game. Bring that FG42 back up to where it used to be. I think the pre-patch FG42 would actually work quite well against the ITRA Burst because they're both accurate, and the time to kill values of the pre-patch FG42 were pretty good. They weren't quite as fast as the ITRA Burst, but then you have that full auto potential, which is a bit more consistent and a little bit more forgiving than the ITRA. And I think that could bring some variety in if they do decide to keep the ITRA in competitive rotation. Of course, this is just my opinion, kind of as an outsider looking into the competitive scene, so take that for what it's worth. I'm not a competitive player. I don't keep track of a lot of what's going on in the competitive scene, so I might be a little bit off base on what the actual competitive scene wants. But I see that as being reasonable, and from the perspective of a public match player, I don't want to see the ITRA become the FG42, where it gets nerfed into the ground and then nobody really uses it anymore. Of course, these are just my opinions though. I'd love to know in the comment section below, what do you guys think of the ITRA Burst? Do you think it's overpowered? Do you think it's perfectly balanced as is? Or do you even think it's underpowered? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.